Pablo Escobar was born in 1949 in Rio Negro, Colombia, but he was raised in the bustling city of Medellín, a place riddled with stark inequalities. From an early age, he understood that wealth was not inherited but taken, and he was determined to rise above the poverty that defined his surroundings. And like many of his peers who accepted their circumstances, Escobar had an insatiable hunger for power and control. His criminal career began modestly stealing tombstones, removing their engravings, and reselling them for profit. It was a crude but effective business, and he soon expanded his operations to car theft and smuggling contraband. His cunning and ruthless nature set him apart, and he quickly earned a reputation as a man unafraid to do whatever it took to succeed. By the early 1970s, Escobar had set his sights on a new, far more lucrative enterprise: cocaine trafficking. At the time, the drug trade was still in its infancy, but he recognized its potential. And like marijuana or heroin, cocaine was pure, addictive, and in high demand, especially in the United States. He forged connections with suppliers in Peru and Bolivia, ensuring a steady flow of raw coca leaves. But it was his logistical genius that truly set him apart. He devised elaborate smuggling techniques, hiding bricks of cocaine in everyday items, hollowed-out appliances, hidden compartments in aircraft, and even in the stomachs of human couriers known as mules. These methods allowed him to bypass law enforcement, feeding a growing market that would soon explode into a billion-dollar industry. As his empire expanded, so did his ambition. Escobar was no longer a small-time criminal. He was now a kingpin. He orchestrated an underground network of labs and airstrips, turning the jungles of Colombia into a production hub for the world's most powerful drug. The scale of his operations was staggering. Cocaine shipments were leaving Colombia by the ton, making their way to the streets of Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. The profits were astronomical. At the height of his power, Escobar's cartel was raking in an estimated $420 million per week, an empire built on addiction, corruption, and violence. He bought politicians, silenced journalists, and crushed his enemies with a ruthlessness that left even seasoned criminals in awe. But power, especially one built on blood money, always comes at a cost. As Escobar's empire grew, so did his list of enemies. Rival cartels, law enforcement, and even the Colombian government began to see him as an untouchable menace. Yet, Escobar believed he was invincible. He operated under one simple rule: plata, plomo, silver or lead. Those who accepted his bribes lived lavishly, while those who refused met a violent end. He was determined to rise to the top, no matter how many lives it cost. His reign of terror had only just begun. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar's Medellín Cartel had become an unstoppable force, controlling nearly 80% of the global cocaine trade. No drug empire in history had ever amassed such power and wealth so quickly. The cartel's operations stretched across continents, with sophisticated smuggling routes feeding an insatiable demand in the United States and Europe. Planes, speedboats, and even submarines transported vast quantities of cocaine, slipping past authorities through bribery and sheer volume. The profits were staggering. So much cash flowed in daily that Escobar's organization spent $2,500 a month on rubber bands just to bundle the stacks of bills. With limited ways to launder the money, he resorted to burying millions in secret locations, filling entire fields with cash, much of which rotted before it could be used. Despite his ruthless nature, Escobar cultivated an image of generosity. He positioned himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, using his immense fortune to build schools, hospitals, and entire neighborhoods for the impoverished in Medellín. To the poor, he was not a criminal but a savior, a man who gave them opportunities the government never provided. His humanitarian efforts solidified his status as a local hero, making him nearly untouchable in the eyes of the public. But beneath this carefully crafted persona lay a man who ruled through fear. Anyone who dared to oppose him, judges, journalists, police officers, and even high-ranking politicians, disappeared or were assassinated in broad daylight. Escobar's infamous motto, plata, plomo, silver or lead, ensured loyalty. Those who accepted his bribes lived, while those who resisted faced certain death. As Escobar's empire expanded, so did its reach. The cartel was smuggling over 15 tons of cocaine into the U.S. every single day, overwhelming law enforcement agencies. Entire cities fell under the grip of cocaine addiction, fueling a public health crisis that spiraled out of control. Miami, once a tourist paradise, became the epicenter of the drug war, with gang violence and cartel shootouts dominating the headlines. The FBI and CIA scrambled to curb the epidemic, but Escobar remained untouchable. He controlled airstrips, processing labs, and an army of loyal Sicarios hitmen willing to kill at his command. The Medellín Cartel had evolved from a mere drug operation into a parallel government, more powerful than Colombia's own institutions. But as Escobar's wealth and influence soared, so did his list of enemies. His war against the Colombian state was escalating, and the government could no longer ignore his unchecked power. International pressure mounted, and law enforcement agencies worldwide united in their efforts to bring him down. Escobar, however, was not a man who surrendered easily. His grip on Colombia was stronger than ever, but his recklessness and arrogance would soon set the stage for an all-out war, one that would shake the nation to its core. Pablo Escobar was no longer satisfied with unimaginable wealth. He wanted complete control. His power had already surpassed that of the Colombian government, but one thing threatened his empire: extradition to the United States. The mere thought of facing American courts and spending life in a foreign prison was unacceptable to him. Determined to keep his grip on Colombia, Escobar launched a campaign of terror that plunged the country into one of its darkest eras. Car bombings, assassinations, and massacres became daily occurrences. Judges who dared to prosecute him were gunned down in broad daylight, police officers were slaughtered by the hundreds, and journalists who spoke out against him disappeared without a trace. Fear gripped the nation, and the streets of Medellín ran red with blood. The world witnessed the true depths of Escobar's brutality on November 27, 1989. When he ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, the attack was meant to eliminate presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, a staunch supporter of extradition. However, Gaviria never boarded the flight. Instead, over 100 innocent passengers were killed in a fiery explosion, marking one of the most heinous acts of terrorism in Colombia's history. Just weeks later, Escobar orchestrated the bombing of Colombia's Department of Security, killing dozens more. His message was clear: anyone who opposed him would pay with their lives. The violence forced the United States to take action, and law enforcement agencies ramped up their efforts to dismantle the Medellín Cartel. Despite his campaign of terror, Escobar's iron grip on Colombia began to slip. The war he had waged had created powerful enemies, both inside and outside his organization. A shadowy vigilante group known as Los Peps emerged, composed of former cartel members, defectors, and U.S.-backed operatives. Their sole mission was to eradicate Escobar and everyone loyal to him. Safe houses were raided, properties were torched, and his associates were executed one by one. Even his closest allies betrayed him, realizing that loyalty to Escobar meant certain death. With both the Colombian government and Los Peps closing in, his once mighty army of sicarios began to abandon him out of fear. As the walls of his empire crumbled, Escobar found himself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. His legendary fortune, once a symbol of invincibility, became a liability. His hidden cash stashes were burned, stolen, or seized. The Colombian National Police, backed by elite U.S. forces, intensified their hunt, and every move he made was tracked. His days as the most powerful drug lord in history were numbered. The man who had once terrorized a nation now found himself on the run, a fugitive trapped in his own nightmare. By 1991, Pablo Escobar had pulled off one of the most audacious power moves in criminal history. He negotiated his own imprisonment. His prison, known as La Catedral, was no ordinary penitentiary. It was a lavish fortress, complete with a nightclub, a soccer field, a jacuzzi, and armed guards who answered only to him. While the Colombian government touted his incarceration as a victory, Escobar continued running the Medellín Cartel from behind its walls, hosting extravagant parties and ordering assassinations with impunity. His arrogance knew no bounds, and his enemies knew it was only a matter of time before he overplayed his hand. That moment came when Escobar executed 2 of his own men inside La Catedral, sending shockwaves through the Colombian government. Fearing the public backlash and realizing they had been humiliated by the drug lord, authorities attempted to transfer him to a real prison. But Escobar was always one step ahead before they could act. He escaped into the mountains of Medellín, vanishing into the shadows. What followed was a 16-month manhunt, during which his empire crumbled. His network of safe houses grew smaller, his loyalists dwindled, and his paranoia consumed him. Once untouchable, Escobar was now a fugitive, hunted by both the government and his former allies. The United States intensified its support, providing the Colombian government with intelligence and surveillance technology to track Escobar's movements. The once mighty drug kingpin was reduced to a ghost, constantly changing locations, desperately clinging to the last remnants of his empire. But every move he made brought him closer to his end. On December 2, 1993, a simple mistake sealed his fate. A phone call to his son was intercepted. Pinpointing his exact location in a modest safe house in Medellín, the Colombian National Police, alongside elite U.S. trained forces, moved in for the final confrontation. As the authorities stormed the house, Escobar made one last desperate attempt to escape, scrambling onto the rooftops with a pistol in hand. Gunfire erupted, and bullets tore through the air. In the chaos, a round struck Escobar in the torso, sending him sprawling. But it was the final bullet, piercing his head, that ended the reign of the king of cocaine. The most infamous drug lord in history lay dead, his lifeless body sprawled across a Medellín rooftop. The man who once ruled with fear and violence had finally met his end, marking the collapse of an empire built on blood, terror, and unimaginable wealth. Pablo Escobar's death marked the end of an era, but his presence never truly faded. On the day of his funeral, thousands of mourners flooded the streets of Medellín, weeping for the man who had built homes for the poor, funded schools, and handed out money like a modern-day Robin Hood. But for the rest of Colombia and the world, he was a ruthless murderer, a terrorist who had left behind a trail of blood and devastation. The Medellín cartel crumbled in his absence, but the drug trade itself did not die. Instead, it evolved, shifting power into new and equally dangerous hands. With Escobar gone, the Cali cartel quickly stepped in to fill the void, using a more sophisticated, less violent strategy to dominate the cocaine trade. As the Medellín empire disintegrated, smaller factions like the Norte del Valle cartel emerged, and soon, the Mexican cartels rose to power, perfecting Escobar's blueprint while learning from his fatal mistakes. Governments celebrated his downfall as a victory, but in truth, the war on drugs raged on, just with new players and deadlier methods. The billions once controlled by Escobar now flowed through different hands, and violence continued to grip the underworld. Colombia struggled to heal, but the scars left by Escobar's reign ran deep. The country became synonymous with cartels, corruption, and lawlessness, a reputation it would spend decades trying to shake off. Over time, Medellín transformed, shedding some of its darkest history, yet Escobar's name remained etched into its soul. His story became legend, immortalized in books, films, and television series, where his ruthlessness, charisma, and power fascinated the world. But behind the myth lay an undeniable truth, one of greed, death, and the insatiable hunger for control. In the end, Pablo Escobar met the same fate as those he had mercilessly executed. His kingdom of cocaine crumbled, and his fortunes disappeared into the hands of those who once feared him. But the cycle he helped create, the rise and fall of drug lords, the endless wars over narcotics, remained unchanged. Long after his final breath, the empire of blood and powder he built lived on, reshaped but never truly erased. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.